This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, 2002, former Congressman James Traficant, then 61 years old, is led away from a Cleveland courtroom in handcuffs after a federal judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. The Democrat had argued that he couldn't be sentenced in court because he'd already been punished by his colleagues getting kicked out of Congress. And the judge was like, yeah, nice try, but you actually broke actual laws and there's an actual sentence here. So they sent him off to jail. He'd been convicted of bribery, tax evasion, racketeering, which is quite a notable trio of shady activities. And Traficant himself was quite a notable person, a huge personality known for his profane tirades on the House floor. And I don't know exactly how to put this, but a kind of trash toupee. I mean, let's be honest.
Pretty good way to put it.
Pretty bad toupee, which we'll get to. But we did get an email from a listener, James, suggested that we talk about Traficant. And I want to read from that email because it frames this really well. So James writes, quote, I grew up in the rural suburbs of Youngstown, Ohio. The odd demise and prosecution of Jim Traficant helps to explain the continued cynicism that abounds in the Rust Belt around American politics, and the story resonates with Donald Trump and George Santos. So, lots of big ideas to get into from that email from James, and I love it when a listener kind of frames the intro for me like that, so keep them coming, listeners. But let's talk about Jim Traficant, his toupee, his behavior, some of the things he actually did for his district while he was in office, and a lot of the things he did for himself. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Should we just talk about the toupee?
I think so. Yeah.
Terrible.
It's bad. It's
bad.
obvious, I think, which is the last thing you want from a toupee. It is also, speaking of parallels with contemporary politicians, quite tall. It reaches like Traficant.
Like 3 or 4 inches above his scalp. Like, it's just the thing. One, it's like two-tone. Like, there's his natural hair that's sort of more white, more gray, white than gray. But there's the toupee that's more gray than white. And so it doesn't match. It doesn't shape his face well. It's like, now I feel like we can embrace baldness a lot more today. You see a lot of bald men, maybe, but it just does not work. And it does kind of feel like there's so much about his personality that is like a little bit Trumpy, a little bit George Santos, that you get this sort of performance of a person that looks like a caricature. Is maybe the best way to sort of
right, somebody who stepped out of a political cartoon.
Yes.
One last note on the toupee. It more hovers above his head than actually sits on it, which is also kind of magnificent given its height.
Yes.
You can kind of tell that it's resting lightly atop
I want to
his head.
smush it. I want to smush it.
A little bit, yeah.
Have either of you seen that show, The Righteous Gemstones, that HBO
Oh,
show
not yet.
about evangelists? It's actually very funny. But if anyone sees that show, all the characters in there, I mean, they're sort of like these over-the-top cheesy evangelists, but they all have these crazy hairs, especially Danny McBride, who stars in it. But that's the vibe that I get from the toupee. And, look, the toupee is the first thing that jumps out, but I think the toupee is a pretty good, metaphor for the overall personality. So, I mean, let's sketch a picture of this person, and then we could talk about what this person did.
Yeah, so Traficant is born into a working class Catholic family. He always talked about his, dad being a truck driver. He's the son of a truck driver. He lets you know where he sort of is in the socioeconomic status. But he goes to college. He graduates from the University of Pittsburgh. He plays football there. He's a pretty decent player. And shortly after that, he becomes a huge champion for the unions, becomes this politician, is known for being bombastic and irreverent and kind of unlikable, but maybe sort of appealing to people who like that, if you know what I mean.
He's our guy, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yes, very much. He's here for the underdog, and people appreciated that about him.
Yeah, that idea that he's breaking the law, but he's breaking the law for us
Yes.
is kind of his vibe. And he does have like a little bit of this civil disobedience thing happening in the 1980s when he ends up going to jail for 3 days for refusing to evict unemployed steelworkers while he was sheriff of Mahoning County. And so he has that going on for him. And then there's also this sense that he's breaking other laws, perhaps less nobly. He is brought up on RICO charges, bribery charges, all kinds of things over the course of his early career. So the later corruption should not come as an enormous surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And he, there's a lot of mob ties here as well. And so he's, accepts bribes from mob figures. And, a lot of that does flow through the unions at that time. We've done tons of stories on characters like this. But, it reminds me a little bit of Marion Barry, right? Where we talked about he just keeps coming back. He's our guy and is able to tell a story to his constituents that, like, all the shady behavior where I'm helping you and all the shady behavior where I'm helping me are actually one and the same, right? And it's just kind of like, this is how the world works, and I'm out there fighting for you, and occasionally, I'll slip a couple $100,000 into my pocket, and occasionally I'll, like, fight for you in Washington. But, until that all falls apart, it really is, it's an amazing trick to sort of pull that off and have it feel like one cohesive story.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there's a history of machine politics in the United States. And this feels a little bit like this. A little for you, a little for me, and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
So true.
The larger context, economic, and then obviously becomes political here, is what's happening in this part of the country in the late 70s into the early 80s. So, he is representing an area that is going basically over the course of his political career from incredibly prosperous industrial base to, outsourcing, there's factories closing, and he sees people in his district really go from like stable and prosperous to real instability. And so that helps him be a champion, I think. But I think it also applies all sorts of pressure on him in terms of how he's going to behave.
Right.
Yeah.
You're seeing this transition from steel belt to rust belt. Yeah. And he is changing from a steel belt Democrat to a rust belt Democrat. And you can hear the kind of politics of decline and white working class populism in his politics. So in the 1980s, as he's running for Congress, he is strongly opposed to immigration. He's strongly opposed to free trade. He wants more protection, more power for labor unions. He's opposed to big business. But he also has these kind of, how do we say, other appeals? So he he's anti-Semitic. He, along with Pat Buchanan, who is also trying to occupy the same lane of the politics of decline and resentment, is defending people who were being prosecuted for participating in the Nazi war crimes of the 1940s. All of this is about shoring up his appeal to the white working class, but it's a mix of economic populism and then this really noxious politics.
And because of that, he's a Democrat, but he's voting like a Republican. Like all of the bills that come before him, he's pretty much not in favor of. Unless it is, something like Clinton's impeachment. That's the one thing he's sort of voted against. But other than that, he's really toting the Republican Party line pretty consistently.
So he even has one of these lines where he says, "I love America, but I hate the government," which is like what Ronald Reagan is saying, right? Like, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And it's like, so part of me looks at Jim Traficant and I'm like, why are you a Democrat?
Yes.
Other than you come from an area in the 60s and 70s that was built on the back of machine Democratic Party politics tied up with unions. And so maybe that's just kind of like the only way you were going to get into office was running as a Democrat. But I don't know.
Also remember that Reagan was the champion of policies that Traficant opposed. Reagan was for more open immigration and for free trade and opposed to unions. And so while there are these issues that kind of read Republican that he's voting on in the 1980s, where he really becomes a little more inscrutable and a little more out of line with the Democratic Party, who actually was kind of where he was in the 1980s, is when Clinton comes in. And Clinton comes in supporting the North America Free Trade Agreement. He's very much a neoliberal instead of a classic Democratic working class candidate. And so Traficant is breaking with his party over things like NAFTA. He's going hard right on immigration. At the same time, the Democrats are moving to the right on immigration, but he is way out in front of them. But then that anti-government line, I think you're right, Jody, is the one that does feel more of a peace with Republicans. And also just like, as Kellie was saying, like his support for Republican policies. He's voting with Newt Gingrich and the New Republicans of the mid-1990s quite a lot. And I think it's no surprise that he is voting against Clinton being held accountable for things.
For shady
accountability
behavior?
is not his strong point.
Yeah, that one doesn't surprise me. That's not a policy decision. That's we men have to stick together.
Should we be investigating these people?
It's interesting too how I think like his base shifts their allegiance. I mean, like for someone who is a Democrat in office, it's only a short matter of time before all of those people are voting Republican because of the circumstances economically and politically that they find themselves in. So there's a lot of shifting happening in this.
Totally. And, you know, I think all of our listeners are connecting these dots, but the way that we just painted a picture of his policies, especially around trade and immigration, and his personality, I mean, that is, you know, that is what Trump has embraced, and that's what the modern Republican Party is. It's basically the seeds were planted in this kind of shifting sands around trade, especially in the 80s into the early 90s. So let's advance this a little bit into the maybe mid-90s. So Traficant continues to kind of buck with his party, continues to be a very bombastic personality. We haven't even gotten into the fact that he just like swears a lot and gives these crazy speeches and, you know, so he's out there, you know. He doesn't just have his head down plugging away.
He ends his speeches saying, "Beam me up," which is a wild tagline.
Yeah.
Why? Beam where? Beam where?
Kellie, everyone needs a tagline. You know, you should get a tagline. But he votes for Denny Hastert, Republican, for House Speaker in 2001. And then, you know, later that year, he's indicted on 10 charges of soliciting bribes in exchange for political favors, making his aides work on his farm, which is a nice just little bit of, you know, why not? And then in 2002, he is convicted of all 10 charges. He's expelled from Congress. And part of me was like, oh, he's expelled from Congress. I wonder what the breakdown here was. He pissed off some Democrats. Maybe they just rallied. It was 420-1 the vote. So, you know, the most bipartisan moment you could possibly conjure in 2002. Only the second congressperson to be removed since the Civil War. This Michael Myers guy was during the Abscam scandal in 1980 was kicked out. So, you know, I don't think this is like he'd made some enemies and they rallied to kick him out. I think it was pretty clear that he'd done a lot of shady stuff and everyone
had no
like,
friends.
We got no friends left.
This is how it feels, though, like very Marion Barry, because his supporters were still like, listen, he had to do some bartering. Like, this was like they're defending him. Like, you know, sometimes you got to do bad to do good. Like, they cannot seem to like relinquish his championship of them, and so they make excuses for the crimes that he committed. Like, it's not really a crime. It was just, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Like, that's how they get around it.
How he is not like Barry is that he did not win re-election in the many times that he ran after that. And he was supported while in prison by David Duke, who I don't think was a huge Marion Barry fan.
That. Yeah, David Duke somehow works his way into this picture. Traficant does run for Congress as an independent, you know, like months after his conviction, and he loses, but he gets 15% of the vote. So yeah, Kellie, you're right. There's that sort of, there are those loyalists. He's in prison until 2009. He runs again in 2010 for his previous seat. He loses, and he dies in 2014 at the age of 73, but after he's involved in a tractor accident on his farm in Ohio. And we've hinted at this throughout, but, you know, does anyone have any more thoughts on how he... I'll go back to this initial email that we got from our listener, James, where he says, you know, this planted the seeds for real cynicism in the Rust Belt about politics, and moreover, this resonates with both Donald Trump and George Santos. Any thoughts there as we wrap up on kind of that assessment?
I mean, it's definitely the case that he was known as a larger-than-life personality and had these ties with criminality, which feel like the through lines with Trump and Santos, that their over-the-top personalities kind of distract for a while from their crimes, but also probably put enough of a spotlight on them to make sure those crimes are investigated. I'm also struck by the context of time. This is 2002. There have been quite a few Supreme Court decisions between then and now that have made probably a lot of what Traficant did not a crime anymore. It feels like bribery and corruption have been largely carved out for political officials in a number of rulings. So it would be interesting to see. I don't think we'd be at 420 to 1 in the same way we were back in 2002.
Well, both because of, the legal structures have shifted, but also just the sort of party politics. I mean, look how long it took them to get George Santos out.
Right, and Bob Menendez is still in there.
Exactly.
All of this feels like if you're not cheating, you're not trying. Like, it just feels like feels like the only way people feel like they can just sort of navigate the system is to game it. Yeah,
and that, I think, when James talks about, how this represented a real rise of cynicism about Washington, and the swamp, that's right. And it's funny how it cuts both ways, right? Because it's like people can point to Traficant or other characters like this and say, look at the way they behave. It's so corrupted, I'm cynical about Washington. And then others can point to it and say, look at the way that they came after him. It's so corrupted. And, people like Trump can kind of play it both ways. They can both represent the swamp, and that causes cynicism, which causes people to weirdly vote for them, and they can kind of fight against the swamp. And so, I just think when you poison the well, if you're cynical enough and opportunistic enough, you can kind of then just sort of have it. You can have it both ways. All right. I think we should leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From P